My name is Montag. I'm working with Accenture. Our office is actually just there. Before joining Accenture, I was working at Umlaut. Some of you might know it. With Umlaut, we joined Accenture 2021. And since then, we've been pushing a bit more towards open source usage in the energy industry. We've been active as Accenture already before in other parts of Linux Foundation for many years, but we are trying to get our traction up also with the Linux Foundation content. Today it will be partially about Linux Foundation itself, but one of the main issues we see as Accenture as basically also not only a consulting company but a system integrator company is that there is a lot of doubts also about open source software, right? So the ones that are here, they are mostly already using open source software. You're working with it eventually for some years. But there is also a lot of your fellow peers that don't do it. And we want to get into it a little bit of why eventually. I think there's also a lot of space and seats available on the right and in the front, of course, as always. And let me introduce my colleague, Hamdi.
Well, I don't think this... perhaps not working. Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcoming you to this session. As Tim said, before I start, usually we start by addressing the elephant in the room, but I would like to address the red hat in the room. Very warm welcome to our friends from Red Hat. Given that we're talking about open source, so here we go. We have one of the biggest suppliers, vendors of open source around the world. We have systems running on Red Hat that we don't even know they're running on Red Hat. So we'll talk a little bit about this. My name is Hamdi. I'm part of the Accenture team as well. I'm based in London and work with Tim, colleagues across the globe in integrating software and technology into control rooms, into grid operations, into utilities in general, just leveraging the best and the latest. And we're here today, as Tim talked about. Let's talk a little bit about open source. Maybe we'd like this to be an interactive session. Feel free to stop us, ask questions. We might ask questions. It would be great to have some collaborations or feedback from you directly. And Tim, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Hamdi. So, first of all, who of you is actively using open source in a day-to-day business? Maybe put your hands up eventually. I would say that's maybe a little bit above 50%. Would you say that you using open source software is more than average of your companies using and doing that, or? Maybe hands up, which company is doing basically a lot of open source? All right, that's maybe 5% or so, maybe a little bit more, yeah. So I think that's an issue we are seeing widely across the market, that there is pioneers like most of you that put their hands up, right, using open source software, even contributing to open source software. But there is still a lot of people that have not engaged with it yet. They might not have to, but I think there's also a lot of people that are just blocked by their organization eventually, or even by, their own, let's say, fear of what will happen if we use it, right? And why? Let us talk about really quickly about why should we use open source, right? And most of you, for that, it's not new, but eventually it helps you to also get a little bit of traction with your other peers in your companies or other companies to actually find a common ground and help them understand why open source software can be helpful. So I think eventually some of you have seen our contribution to the flexibility management piece, and I got some questions during the presentation, but also afterwards in the break. Okay, isn't that super complicated if you have all those different tools and all those different blocks and so on? And if you split up an application that used to be run in one into different pieces, and well, that is the part about modularity, that we actually want to build different functional blocks, different application blocks to enable also to react faster to change. You all know, you've heard the story probably 10 times today, that due to the renewables and so on, penetration in the grid and other changing factors, also regulatory factors, we have to adopt our systems all the time basically, and we are just too slow doing that if we have to exchange the overall combination of all functional blocks instead of adding one or changing one, adopting one, and so on. Then it becomes really difficult if you have one vendor and that vendor is supplying, for example, 80% of the market, and then all of a sudden everybody has to change, everybody has to implement, due to regulatory changes, a new solution, a new optimization or a new tooling, and this vendor is just overloaded with the requests. I mean, from a money point of view, that's probably interesting for the vendor, right? But typically that's also a lot of stress on the vendor side, I can tell you, and therefore it could help also to become more vendor agnostic, but I'm sure some of you have heard that story already. The accessibility open source, I think that's also a really good thing. So when we started developing different type of utility solutions, we actually also usually started using open source software. Because in the end, it always helps to get a start, to at least trial and error a little bit before going into a product stage, and deciding on where do you actually want to go with the solution and where do you want to go. And it's more easy to also adopt those solutions that are available and customize them to their needs. Because in the end, open source is not only free software, it's not free software, right? But it's a standard among different peers to describe how a certain type of software product should look like in the very basis. And of course, that needs some customization and also some adoption to the needs of the specific utility. And I think that's also one of the major points where a lot of utilities are nowadays still struggling. Yeah, but this solution that's there on open source, it doesn't really fit my needs. Yes, of course it doesn't, right? It covers eventually 50 or 20 or 70% of your needs, but if you use that solution and you contribute, you can actually bring it up to 100% match. Eventually you have to put in some effort, but it's still less effort than if you would go to a vendor and tell him, I need all those 5,000 or 6,000 pages of customizing in your product and so on, and both sides are really unhappy with that in the end. So, from that, it's just a few of points where we think that actually collaboration makes sense and open source can help to do that collaboration and to standardize that. And to give you a little bit more insights eventually into what does it mean, for example, for grid operators, right? What kind of contributions can, for example, Linux Foundation do in a sense of enterprise architecture? Where can it support? I would hand over to Hamdi.
I think this is working, so you can keep that. Thank you. Well, maybe before we move on, have we missed anything from why open source is a good way to move forward? Has anyone in the room, or is anyone in the room, think that there is a big thing we're not addressing here? Because, for example, for me, one of the biggest things about open source is probably the last bit, which is quick access to solutions. Grids are different, they are unique. However, the challenges on the grid, they're sort of sometimes similar. So if someone else solved a problem that I have, and I can customize that solution, that's probably one of the best things about open source. So anything you think we've missed that you'd like to share with the room? Cool. In this case, I'll just move on. And yeah, sorry. Oh, okay. So moving on, why am I presenting this? And this says at the top, DSO. If you want to make it TSO, just change the ADMS into EMS and few tweaks. But looking at the reference architecture for a DSO or for a grid operator, as you can see on this side, we do have our IT systems. We have our OT systems. There is a mishmash between them data-wise, so we'll have our data, our enterprise data platform, and obviously we're not talking much about data today, but data is the main enabler for everything. And you've got your field devices around your demand response, your EVs, your storage, everything that's emerging behind the meter, everything that we have in front of the meter, with all of the complications of grid connections, timed connections, all of the curtailments, all of these things happening. So this is a quite complicated, ever-evolving architecture for grid operators. And open source can actually help in few of these areas. Sorry, Tim.
One other question, since we wrote interactive on the session. So, are you familiar with similar, let's say, architectures? It's more like a functional block architecture, or like a systems view, I would say, right? So I think that's most of the systems that are relevant for a DSO, TSO. I'm not asking you to find the gaps. If you find one, please tell us afterwards, not now. But what would you believe is like the coverage of Linux Foundation nowadays of those functional blocks?
So maybe I'll shout out some stuff. How much of the systems in the IT side you think Linux can cover? If you think they cover 50%, just raise your hand. Above risk, 50%. Below, maybe 25%. Nice, okay. Anyone thinks that we cover 100%? I doubted that, okay. On the OT system, so this box here, 50% and above. That's cool, 25% and above. And the last bit on our field devices, this side, 50%. I'm sounding like an auction, sorry. 25%. Right, so maybe let's uncover the answer. And in this case, when we go to the next, you can see all these boxes where the current Linux Foundation distributions exist. So you actually have quite a lot of covering. Maybe this says billing, but actually this is about the metering and the settlements, right? We've got things around the enterprise asset management, our GIS. We even have things around our IoT sensor data and gateways. We have a lot of work that's happening around the EV integration, whether that on the OCPP or whether that on the charging sessions themselves. We have on the storage, renewable energy integration. There's quite a lot of open source packages that covers actually our existing or the future. So by a quick look, I think we do cover more than 50%. So basically a pat on the shoulder for everyone who said above 50%. Please.
Yeah, just like, I mean, I think this is a great pick, but I think assuming that one block for one of these applications, what is the application covers the entire block that you have on the individual?
That's quite interesting, and you are quite right. So maybe it does not cover the entire block. However, I will go back to what Tim said at the beginning. Open source might not cover all your needs. However, it gives you the vehicle to, rather than starting from zero, that you can contribute and cover more. But saying that, for example, on the EV, V2G parts, your OCPP does cover your entire value chain. So, and some of the other elements. We have colleagues from Aliander today as well who have developed some of these things that would cover a lot of the blocks themselves. But you're entirely right. It's not necessarily something that it's an off-the-shelf that you would buy, plug and play. No, you would need to contribute a little bit, modify a little bit, and
I'm not even talking about off-the-shelf. I'm talking about the fact that most of these architectural blocks contain more than the applications that, right? They serve more functions. They are more elaborate than even the applications within them are great. They don't cover the entire architectural domain that is represented by your architecture.
you're also right. This is, yeah.
Like you might be lucky because we cover 25% off that block.
Yeah, you're entirely right. I fully agree. And this is also, just caveat, this is a simplified view. Each of these blocks could actually be broken down into even smaller blocks. So fully agree with that.
The major point, I think, is typically if you want to start the discussion, as you mentioned it, right, there needs to be an entrance, basically, yeah, for new users, contributors, I don't know, potential partners of Linux Foundation Energy, right? And the entrance is super difficult at the moment, I would say. Maybe I know of some people here in the room that have thought about it several times, but they haven't found their way in. And I think that's a difficulty that we have to tackle. It's not only about open source. It's not only about Linux Foundation itself, as one body, but it's also about the utilities industry, right? And we have difficulties to get that moved. And I think last year we had the discussions in Brussels. Okay, how can we actually enable that? And we believe that in the end, it's often the map that's missing, right? The map that helps you to understand, okay, what are the first steps I need to take if I want to go on that journey? And from the last few years, where we actually started to implement also open source-based solutions with different clients, we gathered a few challenges and also mitigation strategies that you can take away maybe as an idea, as a point of discussion, that other clients of ours have faced in the past as well, right? And where they had difficulties to actually start that journey. If you don't have any other questions to this one, and probably it's not complete, right? There's maybe eventually some other parts missing, not yet in there, but eventually we can work on it to add it. Please contact us after the discussion here.
As with open source, we're ever evolving as well, so we keep updating these. Please.
So related to challenges and open source adoption, let's say mitigations, I think one of the major points I often heard, and that's actually a collection of feedback I received the last few years from different clients when trying to implement open source solutions. So first one is usually security and compliance. So depending on the maturity of your company of using open source, there is difficulties in how do I actually make sure that open source software is secure? Is open source software secure at all, right? Can anybody just contribute anything and build in any let's say backdoors or whatever, right? And we heard today that some parts of LF Energy and LF Energy is supporting also security audits. So I think that's also an important message. Of course, using open source software is secure. Otherwise, most of our cloud architecture or cloud infrastructure wouldn't work today, right? And would be down all the time. Of course, there is the risk of security breaches, but on the same side, I believe at least you guys that know open source software very well know that open source software is also a good step towards having more security by more peer reviews and so on. And that's one of the most prejudices that open source software has, I would say, in the last few years that came up. But also about how do we test and test the software automatically. That's something that is typically not provided by the LF projects itself. So you'll have to find in your organizations a mode where you can actually also secure that whenever you deliver and you roll out open source software-based products, that is also true for all other products. Actually, this software is tested well and doesn't have any compliance issues. Then second point is the executive buy-in. So maybe once more a question. So who has top-level support of your executives for implementing an open source strategy? And that's also, again, maybe less than 5 or 10%. But yeah, that's also still often an issue, to get the top management on board, right? To get their buy-in and to actually increase awareness of the possibilities that you can gain. Often executives think about it as a competitive disadvantage. Yeah, if we publish our software, somebody else will take it and they will maybe move ahead in the market or so. But in the end, I think that's also, I think I had a talk yesterday with someone, that's also the other way around. Yeah, not using open source software can be a competitive disadvantage. Due to the investments you have to undertake, and the missing standardization that you can do with open source software, where you have to develop proprietary software while others could contribute and you could share the costs for it. Second and third point are integration of new solutions and also the post-deployment support. So typically that is the point where I believe that the development, also joint development, can help. If we think about, for example, power system calculation tools, having more validation, having different type of grid structures being analyzed and evaluated, that can actually help with the content and the quality of the software itself, right? And that can actually help you to bring that that further. In the license management, I think most of you have used open source software. So have you like an open source procurement policy, for example? You have legal terms and so on that can automatically, let's say, be used whenever you are working with open source software, because that's also something that I have not seen, let's say, some 5 to 10 years back. Yeah, that developed a lot lately. But where do you stand at the moment? Do you have such a policy, how to use open source software? I mean, of course, Java, Linux and so on. I guess that's a no-brainer, but what about maybe the more user part of the audience that are not developing software that much themselves, more integrating the software or using it? You have one at Tenet, I guess?
Yeah, I'm Edwin. I'm the architect at Tenet. I am also a fervent open source contributor for years. So I think I know my way around. But it's an interesting question, because we have a lot of open source stuff into our development processes that developers don't even think about licensing or not. Like a Log4j library or Airflow or whatever is just taken into their applications without thinking about, do I need to license this or support this? Because if it breaks, does the company have a problem? But then we come at a certain state that we say, okay, we need a process orchestrator like Airflow or maybe Camuna for the Java ecosystem. And then I say, wait, we need to support this, because if the process orchestrator doesn't work, it's a product on itself, we need a license. But where is then the threshold for thinking about when to license open source software and when to just get it from the internet and just use it? There is something that's in my mind. Can we even make a policy for that, or is it a common sense thing? How do others think about that?
Yeah, I think one of the major challenges is that understanding the open source license models itself is already the first start, right? I bet, I don't know, in some companies, clients of ours, I've been in contact with, if you enter procurement and you talk about open source licenses, they sometimes ask you, okay, so how much do we have to pay for it, that it's ours? It's like misunderstanding and not the right level of education in sometimes. I bet there's a lot of companies around here that are way more advanced and they have maybe procurement offices designated for open source, yeah, or they have their own policies, but that's a real issue. Yeah? Also using, like as you say, employees using open source software, not only from Linux Foundation, yeah, but I mean you named Airflow, for example. There's a lot of different products around, also Kubernetes and so on, where everybody is using it nowadays, but I'm not sure if every company has actually in their governance implemented a control mechanism to make sure that you're also not unaligned, let's say, with the open source license itself. So you've seen now most of the challenges we put here and we saw the last few years. Talent is for sure also a point, but what are the, let's say, the biggest challenges you have seen in the last few years? And I know here's a few people that have a long path in open source in their organization. What was like the biggest challenge you had?
It's actually buy-in from middle management. It's something new. We don't have time. We don't see the value. And first of all, why should we put in the effort? But they are big-time consumers of it. So there needs to be some sort of way of visualizing your bill of materials, like you know on your Nutella or whatever you buy in the shop. What's in it? So you can actually do risk assessment, and we're very far from that. And I think Accenture would be a great place to actually accelerate that information level so they can make informed decisions. Because right now, even if you get top executives to buy into it, you have the whole culture of middle management that you need to convince as well.
Thank you.
Really liked that point, and I think one other aspect is the processes that you bump up against as well. So a lot of these middle managers, right, they have certain KPIs they have to meet, and not just that, but also your procurement cycles, your budgeting cycles are mostly set up for either the make or buy options, right? So you can somehow procure software, or you can budget that you hire some more people to make it, but anything in the middle of more like partnership, using some combination of open source and self-made, et cetera, is a really whole new thing that the processes are not set up for.
Thank you. I believe the procurement topic is really an important one. I've once heard from a procurement officer, yeah, but how am I now supposed to compare this commercial solution with license costs to this open source solution without license costs? So.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, one of the biggest ones that I've seen is architecture itself, or the lack thereof, usually. So the reason I pushed back against the picture earlier is because I've definitely been in a conversation with an architect or a manager, most often a manager, that would see the architectural block and see one application and say, well, but we've got this covered, right? And I think the whole point of being able to say, no, like we actually miss a capability here, and there is this option out there that we can put in here, and it could be open source. So even the motivation for why you would need automation or an application to serve that purpose.
Thank you. So we're coming to an end, I guess, time-wise, even though we started a minute later. So we have a few points. I don't want to go through all of them, but introducing open source software, how can, for example, system integrators help? And I heard at least one comment. So I think it's on the strategic part of advisory, right? Making the management understand actually how this can actually pay out. It's probably on the change management part, since a lot of employees have not dealt with open source and how to use it, how to behave with it. It's also on the technology integration and customization, because as we found out at the beginning, not every open source tool available has 100% coverage. And in the end, it's also about the compliance stuff, governance stuff, procurement, as we just heard. But also developing communities, engagement, and also a collaborative development of software. And I think that's where actually different users of that open source software need to come together and also build working groups together eventually, or at least contribute in a way that the community is also profiting out of it. Last but not least, training, support, I don't know, depending on what are the needs of your organization. Typically, if you enter a new piece of software, let's imagine you would like to introduce Sonio, from Professor Monti, then that would be probably also needing some training at the beginning to getting to understand the software, and that would be, I think, things where system integrators of different types can support that process. And yeah, that's basically it. If you don't have any other questions, Do you have other questions? Anything you wanted to ask?
Well, you can also always catch us outside. We can talk more in depth one-to-one if you have any specific questions. Maybe thank you very much for listening to us and contributions. Very appreciated.
Yeah, and if you want to talk architecture a little bit more in detail, we can also do that outside. But
yes, exactly.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone.